Hello girls. So now that you finished the internal, we are back at photosynthesis, and last time we met in class we talked about leaf adaptations and how it is adapted to allow as much photosynthesis as possible. So as we said, leaves have a large surface area. They're very thin, so light can penetrate and reach all the cells. They have air spaces to allow diffusion of gases, mostly carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide is one of the reactants needed for photosynthesis. They have transport vessels because water is needed as well for photosynthesis, and the lower epidermis has little stomata, which are little pores that allow entry and exit of oxygen and carbon dioxide. In each of the leaf cells you find organelles, the chloroplasts, and the chloroplasts are the organelles that can absorb light. So when we take a closer look at the chloroplast, what you can see here is that a chloroplast is surrounded by two outer membranes. That makes it different from mitochondria. Mitochondria have only one outer membrane. So chloroplasts have a double outer membrane, and then inside you have these stacks of membranes, highly folded. They look like stacks of pancakes. One of these pancakes is called a thylakoid, and a whole stack of thylakoid is called a granum, and many of them are called grana, and the space around them is called stroma. The reason chloroplasts have such high surface area is because the pigments that capture the light are embedded in this membrane. Now let's have a closer look at the pigments. You all have heard about chlorophyll before. There are two types of chlorophyll, chlorophyll A and B, and especially B is, chlorophyll is the main pigment for absorbing light, but there are a few others which absorb light in a slightly different spectrum, and by combining all of these, plants can absorb in a little wider spectrum of wavelengths than they could if they only had chloroplasts. So when we look at this diagram here, you can see this would be the chloroplast by a chlorophyll by itself, but by combining it with all the others, you get a much wider absorption spectrum. You see that in this area here, between 500 and 600 nanometers approximately, only very light isn't absorbed very much at all. So this is the wavelength of light that is actually reflected from the leaves, and you see that these are the colors green and yellow, and that's why the leaves appear yellow to us. Depending on the exact combination of the pigments that the plant contains, plants can have different shades of green. Now, when we go to the next slide, here you see the result that you get when you do chromatography of plant pigments, and here you see all the chlorophylls and the two accessory pigments, xanthophyll and carotene, showing up, and it actually looks very pretty, and you can see the different shades of green, orange and red. Here is another diagram of a chloroplast. So all these pigments are embedded in these thylakoid membranes. Now when we look at the reaction that is happening, just like in respiration, we can see that there are several steps. In this case there are two. The first one is a light-dependent reaction, which is happening in the thylakoid membranes. And the second one is the Calvin cycle, named after Mr. Calvin, who described this Calvin cycle, and that happens in the space between the thylakoids, so in the stroma of the photosynthesis, of the chloroplast, excuse me. You can already see needed for the reaction here is water, and obviously light energy, and oxygen is made as a waste product. Made in this reaction is ATP and NADPH. So just like in respiration, we have a carrier molecule that carries hydrogen atoms from one reaction or from one chain of reactions to the other. In respiration, this molecule was called NAD. In photosynthesis, this molecule is called NADP. So remember P for photosynthesis. So in the light-dependent reaction, the plant makes ATP and NADPH. Both of them get fed into the Calvin cycle. For Calvin cycle, the plant also needs carbon dioxide. Now, when you look at the carbon dioxide, it's made up of carbon and oxygen, obviously. However, when you look at the sugar molecule, it's made carbon and oxygen, but also hydrogens. So to build a sugar molecule, hydrogen needs to be added to carbon dioxide. And the NADPH is the molecule that is delivering the hydrogen for that step. And the ATP is giving the energy that is needed to put together a sugar molecule. So here is another representation of the same context. The light reaction in the thylakoid membrane produces oxygen as a waste product, ATP and NADPH. ATP and then NADPH then gets delivered to the Calvin cycle, and the Calvin cycle then uses the carbon dioxide, the ATP and the NADPH to put together a glucose molecule. We call the first one the light reaction because light is needed for this reaction. The second one is also often called the light-independent reaction because that one doesn't need any light. It can actually happen in the dark. So light is only needed in the very first one, which happens in the thylakoid membranes and where the ATP and the NADPH are made. So let's have a closer look at the light-dependent reaction, the one that happens in the thylakoid membrane. Here's a really good summary of this reaction. So in this thylakoid membrane, you find two so-called photosystems, which are made of different types of chloroplasts, which absorb in slightly different wavelengths. So this absorbs in the wavelengths of 680 and this absorbs in the wavelengths of 700, and surrounded are all sorts of accessory pigments like more chloroplast and the other accessory pigments that we talked about. So light hits one of these pigments and the electrons get excited and they jump up to the so-called primary acceptor. So this is the protein, and then from here the electrons get passed on a chain of proteins to the next photosystem. While they get passed on from one to the other, these electrons give up energy, represented in this diagram by a slope sloping down. And this energy is used to make ATP. So that should look fairly familiar. It's quite similar to the electron transport chain in respiration, where the energy of the electrons is also used to make ATP, and the electrons are also passed on from one protein complex to another. So same thing happens here as well. Now we also need hydrogen to make NADPH. Where does the hydrogen come from? The hydrogen actually comes from splitting water. So this is where the water comes in. In that very first step, this water molecule is divided into oxygen and hydrogen. The oxygen is then given off as a waste product. The electrons get excited and the hydrogens get passed onto NADP to make NADPH. So electrons get excited. ATP is made when the high energy electrons are passed on through these proteins from one to the next, and then the electrons get excited again, and together with the H+ ions from the start, they now make NADPH. Now, in the next step, the Calvin cycle, the plant needs carbon dioxide, and it combines the carbon dioxide with the hydrogen that gets delivered by the NADPH molecules and makes glucose. And this is a process that takes energy because the one molecule of glucose it's quite a complex molecule with quite a lot of bonds, and it holds a lot of energy, whereas carbon dioxide is a very simple molecule and holds very little energy. So where does this extra energy come from that gets put into this glucose molecule? It comes from the ATP that has been made in the light-dependent reaction. So as a result of the Calvin cycle, we get a molecule of glucose. The ATP gets changed into ADP as it gives up its energy, and the NADPH gets changed back into NADP as it gives up its hydrogen. NADP and ADP then go back to the light reaction, and ADP gets transformed into ATP again, and NADP plus picks up more hydrogens. So here we have the summary again. Light reaction here makes ATP and NADPH, which then gets used up in the carbon cycle to make sugar from carbon dioxide, and then the ADPs and the NADP pluses get delivered back to the light reaction where they get transformed into ATP again and into NADPH. So it's a constant exchange here of ATP, ADP, and NADPH and NADP. Often in the exam, they're not asking you to describe the process of photosynthesis in detail, but they might ask you to explain which factors affect photosynthesis. So first of all, there would be temperature, and the reason photosynthesis depends on temperature is because it is an enzyme-driven process. So when it is very cold, which is on this side of the graph, the enzymes are very slow. The kinetic energy of enzymes and also the reactants is low, and therefore reaction rate is low. When it is too hot on this side, the enzymes denature and photosynthesis comes to a complete halt. So there is an area up here where the enzymes work best and where you have the highest reaction rate, and this is called the optimum